Thank you. Ooh,
You're
I
okay.
think we're good. Can we hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Hi. I'm so happy to be here and so happy to be on this panel and learned a lot from the folks who spoke before me and was taking a few notes because I want to incorporate some of their thoughts into my remarks. But first, let me start by introducing myself. My name is Ariana Kelly. I'm a state delegate. As you heard, I represent Bethesda, Chevy Chase, and Potomac in the Maryland legislature. For those of you who don't know, that's the hometown of Christine Blasey Ford and Brett Kavanaugh. So a lot of that was really, my legislative district was really ground zero for a lot of that controversy, which was very difficult, particularly for a lot of the kids who were in the high schools and the middle schools, sort of living through that. The reason I'm mentioning that is because the story I want to tell you about how we passed consent education in Maryland is really related to the students who were currently in high schools and middle schools, who were sort of part of this larger social conversation that we're having in the Me Too era. And so I want to give credit to the young people who were really the driving force behind this. And also, before I forget, just want to note that I'm so stoked about this AFT resolution. I cannot wait to hear what you have to say. Okay, so I'm really not sure this mic, are you guys getting the feedback? I'm going to,
Yeah, I think that's.
all right, is that better?
Can you hear? Yeah, they can hear. So.
Okay, you guys can hear, and I'm going to ignore the mic. How about that? So I'm Ariana. I represent District 16. My professional background is working in advocacy. I was a journalist. I also worked for Girls Inc. I worked for an organization called Moms Rising, and I worked for an organization called NARAL, which does women's health work. The reason that professional background is important is that in my role as a legislator, I had a few tools at my disposal when this issue really came up for us in my community. I'm a mom, and I have two kids. I have a freshman in high school and a fifth grader, daughter and a son. So I definitely look at these issues through the lens of a parent, but both the parent of a boy and the parent of a girl. But this story is about my daughter. So there's a story in your packet. You can see the News 4 did a little bit of coverage. And we actually got quite a bit of press on a piece of legislation I worked on with my daughter, which is introducing consent into the sex ed curriculum in the state of Maryland. So my daughter was in middle school. She's a freshman in high school now. But when she was in middle school, we were seeing all these stories about Brock Turner and Bill Cosby, and the Donald Trump election was going on. And she was really, it was impossible for her to not be paying attention to these things. I think of her as a sweet 11, 12-year-old girl, but she and her friends are all over the social media, and they are talking about these things, and it is impacting them and their sense of self and their sense of safety in the world. There's just no way around it. And I would talk to her about when these stories were in the news, what her interpretation was, and I was pleased that she had an ability to sort of do a critical analysis of the way women were treated in the world and sort of what she had to look forward to when she was in college in terms of what's going on in the movement around campus sexual assault. I was happy that she was feeling a sense of power in her life and awareness. That being said, I did also reflect back to my own time in middle school, and I knew that at least when I was in middle school, again, also in Bethesda, Maryland in the 1990s, in addition to having an academic understanding of things, there was a real-life understanding of what was happening on the ground, which is kids learning about sexuality in the school, not necessarily through the curriculum. You know, there was groping in the school. There were inappropriate comments in the school. There was sexual harassment and sexual assault. I know in my middle school when I was there, I remember still vividly, you know, one of the first terrifying experiences I had as a young person was walking down a very crowded middle school staircase. All of our schools are overcrowded, and just having a young man who was 2 grades above me grab me right here and say, "Oh, you're growing." And he felt like it was his right to do that to my young body. And so I was afraid for my daughter as she was entering puberty and in this context where she's thinking about these things. And I really wanted her to feel empowered, not disempowered. So I was brokenhearted on election night when she said to me, "Mommy, Donald Trump was elected, and that makes me feel so powerless. It makes me feel like the world doesn't care about the way he treated women and talked about women and girls, and that makes me feel powerless. And I didn't know what to do as a parent, but I didn't know what to do as a legislator. I immediately switched on my legislator hat, and I just said, there is no way you are powerless. We have power, we have electoral power, we have the power and the ability to change public policy, maybe not at the federal level, but certainly at the local level. So I talked to her and said, what can we do? What kind of legislation could we put in that would make you feel better, like you have a sense of power and that your friends can make a difference? And that's how we came up with the idea about introducing consent into the sex ed curriculum. She was currently she was in middle school, she was participating in the sex ed curriculum. She thought it was a little bit weird how they were learning about preventing pregnancy, which is really important, and preventing STDs and HIV, which is really important. But they didn't start with that basic building block, which is respect each other, and everybody who is engaging in sexual activity needs to be excited about doing it, and she picked out for herself that there was this theme running through, or really an undercurrent in the sex ed curriculum that didn't acknowledge women's ownership over their own bodies and their own sexuality. And I knew from my time working in advocacy why that was. I knew legislatively that we had been so worried, obviously in the 90s, we needed to get HIV/AIDS education into the curriculum. We needed to make sure, it was a huge win to get pregnancy prevention and contraception into curricula. It was a big deal to get that very important information in front of our students, but we did it without having that bigger picture conversation of really this need of flipping the script about how we talk about sexuality. Back in the 1950s, if you see the old videos and the old books about it, it's really this, he really wants it because he's allowed to want sex and she's not, no. And then we're basically teaching our boys that they're supposed to coerce girls into sexual activity. And that is the underlying concept that all of our sex ed curricula is built upon, and we had to rip that rug out from under it. That's certainly not the way people think about sexuality in a modern era, and that is certainly not the way our justice system thinks about sexuality, and that's not the way we should be teaching our children about sexuality. So by including consent at the very beginning, starting in the early ages when it's appropriate to talk about should you touch someone or not, do they want you to or not, really age-appropriate conversations is then creating the foundation for us to later teach about contraception and HIV and these other things in a context that does not imply that both girls and boys have control over their own bodies. So we put in a piece of legislation. It was interesting because we started as a local bill. I just wanted to impact our local school district, just the county she goes to. We had unanimous support from the legislators in Montgomery County to pass this bill. The Board of Education came to the table and they were opposing the bill. What happened, because, we all know, right, boards of education don't like to be told what to do. I get it. It's difficult. That being said, they sat through the hearing, and it wasn't just my daughter testifying. I was shocked and thrilled to see a ton of students show up for this. We didn't promote it. We thought it was going to be one witness testifying, explaining why this was important. But we had student groups signed up, boys and girls, testifying about the sexual assaults and sexual harassment that they and their friends had experienced in school, and urging the county to make this change. So with that, the Board of Ed completely switched their opposition, turned around, and decided to work with us to support this change, and we were thrilled for that. However, with all good things, basically what happened was Montgomery County urged us to try and introduce it as a statewide bill. They thought if it's good enough for Montgomery County, we should really be able to do this everywhere in the state of Maryland. We introduced it as a statewide bill, and it passed with strong bipartisan support in the House of Delegates, which is where I serve. But the Senate, which is slightly more conservative, slightly older, and slightly less female, and slightly less racially diverse, it died on the Senate floor. It died a painful death. The kind of debate that you really don't want to hear happening was happening. There were, and I will say, I'm a Democrat, but Democrats and Republicans both supported this bill very strongly in the end. But you had Democratic senators standing up saying things like, if we pass this bill, we're basically telling our daughters they have the right to consent. Yeah, these are elected officials. They were out of step with, they weren't even in 1970. I mean, they were really out of step. But they voted the bill down because they were afraid of the kind of change that this real huge frame shift in how we teach children about sexuality, they were afraid of what it meant. But then a really interesting thing happened, right? The Me Too movement happened in the interim. So the bill died on the last day of legislative session in 2017, right? And then over the summer, that's when we saw the Me Too movement start up. It was really picking up steam, and the press was paying attention, and it was this collective action going on. And by the time the legislature came back the next year, it passed with bipartisan support, both chambers, and the governor could not wait to sign it. And the only thing that was different in the bill was the fact that the rest of the community had been speaking up and standing up and talking about how important these issues were. That's the only thing that changed. So I was so excited, particularly for the children who were working on this. I can't tell you how hard it was for me as a parent, and I know from my fellow legislators, to hear these middle school and high school students talk to us in graphic detail about the kinds of things they're experiencing. But I know that they're real. I'll just leave and then pass it off to Janella because I can't wait to hear her comments. But we know that they're real because we did do a little research to pull up some statistics, and we found out that 56% of girls in 7th to 12th grade are sexually harassed, which is consistent with what my experience was and what my daughter's experience was. Also, 42% of female rape victims are first raped before they're 18. So this is an issue that is relevant for our high school and middle school population. And a lot of these assaults are happening on school grounds. I don't have the statistic in front of me, but it was something like, there it is, 39%. 39% of sexual assaults of high school girls take place at school. So again, this is a really relevant issue to the points that were raised before me. It's not something we as a society or a community can afford to ignore because it's doing a disservice to our students if we do. So I'm really excited we were able to pass this bill in Maryland. I'm so excited people are working on it in other states, and I can't wait to hear about what's next.